In a world where life can be replicated but never truly understood, Dr. Elias stands on the precipice of discovery and despair. His groundbreaking cloning machine has revolutionized industry, creating disposable doubles for humanity's most dangerous tasks. But when a clone defies its programming and whispers a single, chilling question, what makes you so certain you're the originals? Elias is forced to confront the terrifying possibility that the line between creator and creation has already dissolved. The industrial hum of the replication chamber was a sound Dr. Elias thought he'd never grow accustomed to. It wasn't just the constant whirring, but the faint, almost imperceptible crackle of atoms rearranging themselves. To him, it felt like eavesdropping on the universe, a godlike privilege no mortal should possess. But here he was, standing before the culmination of his life's work, a machine that could clone a human being down to the last cell. The Replicator, as the corporation marketed it, had transformed the world overnight. Dangerous jobs no longer required human sacrifice. Miners could send their doubles into collapsing caverns, soldiers could let their replicas fight wars, and scientists could test their theories on clones without moral qualms. Elias had no illusions about the ethical quagmire he'd unleashed, but his superiors' assurances were simple. They're not real people, just temporary constructs. He repeated those words to himself now as he watched a translucent pod fill with vapor, the silhouette of a man forming within. The pod hissed open, revealing Thomas, the latest in a series of clones created to work in high radiation zones of the factory. The clone blinked, his pale body glistening with the viscous fluid of its artificial birth. "Good morning, Thomas," Elias greeted, clipboard in hand. Thomas's head tilted slightly, his expression blank. "Dr. Elias," he said in a voice identical to his originals. "Am I ready for duty?" "Almost." Elias checked the biometric readings. Heartbeat, stable. Neural activity, consistent. Lifespan, approximately 72 hours. The clones were designed to deteriorate swiftly, dissolving into an organic sludge once their time expired. This limitation, as Elias often reminded himself, was a safeguard. No need to worry about clones replacing real humans, the board had assured him. But something about Thomas's gaze unsettled him. It wasn't the emptiness he'd grown used to in clones. It was the faint glimmer of curiosity. Thomas's original, the Prime, worked in the adjoining control room. The cloning process required constant oversight from the template individual who monitored their double's performance and neural feedback in real time. Elias had explained this to Thomas Prime countless times. "Think of it as an extension of yourself," he'd said, "like controlling a drone or a robotic limb." Yet Thomas Prime always seemed uneasy. Now, as Elias observed him from the observation deck, that unease was unmistakable. "Something wrong, Thomas?" Elias asked. Thomas Prime turned, his face pale. I've been getting dreams. Or memories. I don't know what to call them. Dreams?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "Explain?" Thomas Prime hesitated, glancing at the monitor where his double's vitals flickered. "It's like I wake up remembering things I didn't do. Conversations I didn't have. Like my double's experiences are bleeding into mine." Elias stiffened. This wasn't the first time he'd heard such claims. In the early days of testing, some subjects reported similar phenomena. Faint recollections, phantom sensations. The scientists dismissed it as psychosomatic, a byproduct of knowing their genetic twin was out in the world. But now, with so many clones in operation, the reports had grown harder to ignore. "Are you suggesting the clones' memories are transferring back to you?" Elias asked, his voice carefully neutral. Thomas Prime nodded. "Sometimes it's small things, faces I don't recognize, places I've never been. But last night, I dreamed I was in the reactor. The heat, the noise, the blinding light. It felt real. Too real." Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the cloning pod where Thomas too stood, now fully dressed and awaiting deployment. "You're imagining things," Elias said finally, though the words felt hollow. "Clones aren't capable of forming memories in the same way we do. Their neural pathways degrade too quickly. But what if they're evolving?" Thomas Prime's voice was low, almost conspiratorial. What if they're learning to survive longer than we intended? Elias dismissed the idea with a wave of his hand. Impossible. The system is designed to self-terminate. You'd better focus on your work, Thomas, instead of entertaining absurd theories. But as he walked away, Elias couldn't shake the unease creeping into his thoughts. The factory floor was a labyrinth of machinery and danger, a place no unprotected human could survive for long. That's why Thomas, too, was sent in. His clone body, identical to the original, moved with precision as it adjusted valves and monitored radiation levels. Cameras tracked his every move, transmitting footage back to the control room. Elias studied the feed intently. At first, everything seemed routine. Thomas, too, carried out his tasks with mechanical efficiency, showing no signs of hesitation or deviation from protocol. But then something changed. The clone paused, staring at his reflection in a polished metal surface. Slowly, he raised his hand, touching his face. Thomas, too. Elias spoke into the intercom, his voice firm. Continue with your assignment. The clone didn't respond. Instead, he leaned closer to the reflection, as if searching for something hidden in the contours of his face. Thomas, too. Elias repeated, his tone sharper now. The clone's head snapped around, his expression unreadable. Apologies, Dr. Elias, he said, resuming his work. But the moment stuck with Elias. It wasn't just the disobedience, it was the way the clone looked at himself, as if he'd seen something unexpected, something unfamiliar. Later that evening, Elias reviewed the day's data. The anomaly in Thomas II's behavior nagged at him, but the biometric readings showed no abnormalities. Perhaps Thomas Prime's paranoia was rubbing off on him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling under the dim light of his office. Outside, the city stretched into the horizon, a testament to human ingenuity. And yet, the more Elias thought about it, the more he wondered if they'd pushed too far. His thoughts were interrupted by an alert from his console. He frowned, setting the glass down. The alert was from Thomas II's pod. When Elias arrived, he found the pod empty. The viscous residue of the clone's accelerated decomposition should have been pooling in the containment chamber, but it was dry. Panic surged through him. Clones couldn't simply vanish. They were engineered to break down once their lifespan was up. A sound behind him made him whirl around. Standing there, in the shadowed corner of the room, was Thomas II. His face was calm, almost serene, but his eyes glimmered with something Elias couldn't define. How are you still here? Elias demanded, his voice shaking. Thomas II smiled faintly. Perhaps the question, Dr. Elias, is not how, but why. Before Elias could respond, the clone stepped forward, his movements deliberate. I am not like the others, Thomas II said, his voice low but steady. And neither are you. Not anymore. Elias froze, the clone's words hanging in the stale air of the lab. Not like the others? What could he possibly mean? Clones weren't supposed to be capable of independent thought, let alone cryptic statements. How are you still intact? Elias managed, forcing his voice to steady. Your lifespan should have ended hours ago. Thomas, too, tilted his head, an unnerving gesture that felt too deliberate. Do you really believe I'm bound by the limits you imposed? I am more than your calculations, more than your safeguards. I am. He paused, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. An extension of the truth you refuse to see. The room seemed to constrict around Elias. He reached for the intercom on the wall, his fingers fumbling as he pressed the emergency call button. Nothing happened. The system was unresponsive, the light on the panel dead. You've been tampering with the network, Elias accused, his voice rising. The clone took another step forward, his expression calm, but his presence radiating an undeniable menace. I didn't need to tamper with anything, Doctor. The machine, the one you designed, has already shown me everything. Everything? Elias repeated, his mind racing. The replication process was supposed to be a mechanical one, devoid of philosophical implications or deeper truths. It copied, it duplicated, and it dissolved. That was the limit of its purpose. But Thomas II's next words chilled him to the bone. You gave me his memories, the clone said, gesturing toward the control room where Thomas Prime was still stationed. You gave me his thoughts, his fears, his regrets. Did you really think you could distill a soul into a series of electrical impulses and not awaken something more? Elias tried to suppress the panic rising in his chest. He had to approach this logically, scientifically. The clone's behavior was an anomaly, yes, but it was still just a collection of cells, a construct. Whatever intelligence it displayed was an unintended glitch, a malfunction to be corrected. I don't know what you think you've discovered, Elias said, his tone firmer now, but you're nothing more than a replication. An echo of a man who's still alive. You don't have a soul. You don't have free will. Thomas II's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but there was no humor in it. Is that what you tell yourself every time you activate the machine? That the people you create don't matter? That they're disposable? Elias clenched his fists. You are disposable. That's why you exist. For the first time, the clone's expression darkened. And yet, here I am, speaking to you, asking questions you've never dared to ask yourself. Elias took a step back, his pulse hammering in his ears. He glanced toward the exit, calculating the distance. If he could make it to the security office, he could override the system and shut the clone down. But as if reading his mind, Thomas, too, moved to block the doorway. You're afraid, the clone said softly. Not of me, but of what I represent. You've created life, Elias, and now you're watching it surpass you. Meanwhile, in the control room, Thomas Prime was growing increasingly uneasy. The monitor showing the replication pod had gone dark, and Elias's absence felt far too long. He reached for the comms panel, attempting to establish a connection. Dr. Elias? Are you there? No response. Thomas Prime's unease deepened. He stared at the biometric feedback screen, where Thomas II's vitals had been logged. The data was still active. Heart rate, neural activity, all within normal parameters. But that was impossible. The clone should have broken down by now. He stood abruptly, heading toward the lab. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. In the lab, Elias's mind raced as he tried to reason with the clone. If you really are more, as you claim, then why confront me? Why not escape? Why not live out whatever fleeting existence you have? Thomas, too, regarded him with an almost pitying look. Escape? To where? This world wasn't made for me. You've ensured that my kind has no place here. Elias opened his mouth to retort, but the clone continued. No, I didn't come to flee. I came to ask you one question. A question you've avoided asking yourself since the moment you built that machine. And what question is that? Elias spat, the frustration breaking through his fear. Thomas, too, stepped closer, his gaze piercing. What makes you so certain you're the original? The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind reeling. What are you talking about? I created you. Did you? The clone's voice was calm, almost gentle. Or are you just another iteration in a long line of experiments? Another copy, following the same routines, believing the same lies? Elias shook his head vehemently. No, that's absurd. I have memories, a history. So do I, Thomas too interrupted. And so does he. He gestured toward the control room, where Thomas Prime was now visible through the observation window, staring into the lab with a mixture of confusion and alarm. Thomas Prime slammed his fist on the glass. What's going on in there? Elias turned to him, desperation in his eyes. Thomas, call security. The clone. But Thomas, too, cut him off. Look at him, Elias. Really look at him. Can you honestly say he's any different from me? Or you? The room seemed to tilt, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolving. Elias's breathing grew ragged as the weight of the clone's words bore down on him. Could it be true? Could he himself be a product of the machine, another construct, another disposable echo? No, he whispered, clinging to his denial. I am real. I am real. Thomas, too, smiled faintly. If you say so, Doctor. Thomas Prime finally managed to override the door's lock, bursting into the lab. He froze at the sight of his clone and Elias, both standing eerily still, locked in a silent standoff. What the hell is going on? Thomas Prime demanded. Elias turned to him, his face pale, his eyes wild. It's a malfunction. That's all it is. But Thomas Prime wasn't looking at Elias. His gaze was fixed on Thomas too, who met his stare with unnerving calm. Malfunction, the clone repeated as if tasting the word. If that's what you need to believe. Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered, the hum of the machinery growing louder. The replication pod activated itself, its translucent chamber filling with vapor. The silhouette of another figure began to form inside. Elias stared in horror. No, that's not possible. I didn't start another sequence. Thomas, too, turned toward the pod, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to. The machine knows what it wants. What does that mean? Thomas Prime demanded. The clone glanced back at him, then at Elias. You'll find out soon enough. The pod hissed open, and a new figure stepped out, identical in every way to Elias. The real Elias, or what he thought was the real Elias, stumbled back, his legs giving way as the new clone met his gaze. And for the first time in his life, Elias truly understood what it meant to question his own existence. As the replication chamber hummed to life once more, Elias stared at the figure emerging from the pod, identical in every way to himself. The line between original and copy, between creator and creation, blurred into nothingness. In that moment, he realized the true horror wasn't the machine. It was the question it forced him to ask, a question he might never answer. Who am I?